So welcome everyone, welcome to today's Dharma talk, and the title of today's Dharma talk is Karma and the Importance of Ethics. So, this is a repeat of a Dharma talk I gave on the middle of the week, on the 27th of September. Today is the 30th of September, and so it's a repeat, but there's a little bit more to this one. This one will be a bit longer. So there's the popular use of the word karma means what goes around comes around, or we get what we give. However, karma literally means actions. And according to a scholar, karma is likened to a seed that we plant, and as a result we eventually have the ripening of the seed and the fruit from that seed. The ripening is called vipaka and the fruit is called phala in Pali. So it means that whatever actions we do, when the conditions are right, we will have the fruit of those actions. There will be a fruit from those actions, and the certain fruits arise with the doer of the actions. So karma is like the psychological impulse behind an action, and it's what sets in motion a chain of causal reactions, or short causal chain of responses that eventually results in a fruit. So the actions must have an intentional component to bear karmic fruit. Well, yeah, to bear karmic fruit, to bear this the fruit of our actions. And intentional actions are divided into wholesome and unwholesome. And I'm going to ask Greg if he can mute himself. Thanks, mate. Or I could try to mute you. Anyway, so unwholesome actions bear unwholesome fruit. Wholesome actions bear wholesome fruit. And there is another popular belief that karma is behind everything that comes forth in our life, everything that arises in our life. However, in reality, it's just part of the bigger picture. It's just part of this whole process that we call life and existence. And there's more to it than just the karma we do. In fact, the way we are is dependent on so many causes and conditions coming together, many of which are completely beyond our control. We can't choose our genes, for example. We can't choose where we've been born and where we've been raised and the schools we go to and our conditioning through life and our cultures and so on. And those who have experienced disasters don't choose to experience those disasters. And even though sometimes people say, people must have collective bad karma to be in the middle of a disaster, it's actually not that case. It's the case that we're in a difficult, a bad situation at a bad time, and it's not the results of, doing some evil karma in the past. And it's beyond our capacity to understand. It's beyond our unenlightened capacity to understand what fruits will result from what particular karma. But it is possible for us to discern wise actions from unwise actions. So karma is not fixed or strictly deterministic, and it's not rigid or a mechanical process, but it is a flexible and fluid dynamic process. And not all the conditions that arise in life, as I was mentioning earlier, can be ascribed to karma. Just because we might become ill with COVID, for example, doesn't mean we've done some evil deed in a past life. It means that we've just become in contact with a virus and we've got a body. So that's the reason why we're getting COVID, not because of some evil deed. So, and also the karmic effect of a deed is not determined by the deed itself, but it's determined by the nature of the person who commits the deed, and also by the circumstances and the context within which it is committed. I mean, that's a weird word, because it's not just bad karma we're talking about good karma as well. It's like when the conditions are right, the fruit occurs. And I notice this when I go on retreats, for example. I may have, I have months of not being in retreat mode and I'm being in work mode and, doing all sorts of things. And then I go on retreat and the circumstances are right for actions of the past to arise. I notice that when I do go on retreats, it's like I'm picking up from a past retreat where I left off on a past retreat. It's like I'm picking up on that. So it's this ripening of the seeds that I planted previously. It's ripening them. It's ripening at particular because of the conditions on which I find myself in. But again, it can be attributed to bad karma as well, or negative karma. So there is a recollection that's used for equanimity, for equanimity actually, but it relates to actions. It relates to our karma, and it is part of the 5 recollections. And for those of you who don't know the 5 recollections, I'll just tell you them now. I'll just recite them for you now, which is a recollection that I did it daily for probably about 20 or 30 years, I think. And I don't do it daily that much these days, but it's in the back of my mind. And the 5 recollections are these. I am of the nature to age. I'm of the nature to have illness. I'm of the nature to die. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, shall one day be parted from me. And this is the 5th recollection is related to karma and the owner of karma, the owner of actions. I am the owner of my actions, born of my actions, heir to my actions, related to my actions. Whatever actions I'm supported by my actions. Whatever actions I shall do of those actions, I shall be the heir. And this relates to other beings as well. All beings are the owners of their actions, heir to their actions, born of their actions, related to their actions, abide supported by their actions. Whatever actions they shall do, of those actions, they shall be the heirs. When I used to do this in Thailand, we used to say it in the particular language. We used to say it in Thai language. And the term for actions was actually karma. So, I'm the owner of my karma, heir to my karma, born of my karma, related to my karma, abide supported by my karma, and so on. And to put it as my friend Patrick Carney says, I am what I have done, I will be what I do. So it's more like we're not what we think, we're what we do, what our actions relate to. It's what we become, what our actions are. And the great and venerable Thich Nhat Hanh would say something like this: my actions are the ground I stand on. It's like that's the foundation of the way we are. And equanimity is a wisdom quality, of course, and it is the understanding that all beings are on their own life trajectories, and how our karma unfolds in very much dependent on the circumstances around us, all sorts of different conditions that are completely beyond our control, including our decisions and our choices with those decisions. The choices of the actions we make dependent on those decisions. So, as I was mentioning before, it's quite complicated to understand the results of particular actions, and this skill was only the Buddha was the only person who really had this skill to understand why people are the way they are. And in addition, it's quite difficult for us to understand how some people who cause a lot of pain and a lot of suffering seem to get away with it, seem to prosper. And I'm thinking of media magnates, for example, someone who's recently retired, I think. I'm not sure what he's done, but he's retired and he's prospered and he's gained a lot of influence, and his publications have probably caused a lot of harm. And I'm not going to mention a name, of course, but they seem to get away with it. And there's also a lot of people who seemingly do a lot of wholesome actions, yet seem to suffer as well. So it's hard to understand it, but nonetheless, it is a law of nature. It is as simple as actions have consequences, And when we start to meditate, we start to dig down deep, and we start to realize our karma. I think what happens with meditation, it's kind of like stopping and being aware, and wholesome things and unwholesome things begin to arise. Our unwholesome actions of the past come up to haunt us and they form a hindrance. One of the hindrances, the hindrance in particular that it forms, is the hindrances of restlessness and worry, otherwise often known as remorse. This feeling of remorse that we've done something wrong, and it invades our consciousness when we're on retreats, for example. And some of you know this story. I mentioned it at the retreat in September. But about 40 years ago, I was married. I was married to a Thai woman, and I had an affair. And the shame and remorse of the suffering that I caused for both my wife, and the person I had an affair with, still comes up on retreats. And I think I mentioned that on the last retreat. It follows me round like a wheel that follows the hoof of an ox that pulls a cart. And I'm just quoting the Dhammapada there. I violated the precepts, and people suffered, including myself. I suffered in terms of the shame and remorse, the shame that I felt at the time, and I also suffered in terms of the remorse that I had later on when I realized what I was doing. And you could think, at first consideration, you could think that I was motivated by lust. I went off and had an affair. I wanted more sex or something like that. But in fact, when I thought about it, when I reflect on it, I was motivated by delusion. And the delusion found excuses for me to break the basic precepts. The basic precepts, the 5 precepts. Restraint in intentionally killing living beings. Restraint in taking that which doesn't belong to us. Harmful speech. Restraint in speaking harmfully or unconstructively and deceiving with our speech. Restraint in sensual misconduct. It's usually relates to sexual misconduct, which is sexual conduct that is harmful to somebody, harmful to someone, hurtful to someone. And obviously we have the horrible results of the horrible harm that sexual abuse causes, but also the harm and hurt that's caused by when someone is unfaithful in their relationship. Someone deviates from their fidelity with a partner. So I was under the mistaken belief, or the delusion if you like, that sexual expression was a spiritual path. And thus I fooled myself into committing unwholesome and hurtful actions. In reality, I was tricked by Mara. Mara, for those of you who don't know, is the tempter. Mara is the personification of evil, I know I said there's probably some comparison with the devil in Christianity, but in Buddhism, it's said that at the time of his awakening, the Buddha, just before his awakening, the Buddha had battle with the 10 armies of Mara. The 10 armies of Mara, they came to battle with him, and he fought them, and he was victorious over them. The 10 armies of Mara are these: sensual pleasures, discontent, hunger and thirst, craving, sloth and torpor, fear, doubt, conceit and ingratitude. 9 is gain, renown, honor, and falsely receiving fame. And the last one is self-exaltation and disparagement of others. I think there was probably a lot more, but I think over the years, the 10 armies of Mara have been summarized into those particular tendencies. So, coming back to the unwholesomeness of karma, despite the unwholesomeness of karma, of some karma, it is not fixed, and it's not possible, and it is possible to atone for our unwholesome actions and make amends. And I think asking for forgiveness is also helpful. And I talked about forgiveness a little bit earlier. My ex-wife rang me about 10 years ago, and she just said, "Malcolm, I forgive you." That was it. It was really nice, but it wasn't until I visited her only a few months ago, after a retreat. Well, I was in the middle of a retreat. I had a break in my retreat. I was down south in the Blue Mountains retreating, and my middle son's 40th birthday was happening up on the coast, up past Coffs Harbour. And I thought it was important that I come to that birthday because it was all the grandkids together, and he'd hired out a whole cabin park, and it was really important. So I took a break from my retreat and drove up, and I made it a particular effort because my ex-partner wasn't going to be at the party. She's quite older than me, and she's married to a much older man. And they weren't mobile, so I went and visited her, and I actually spoke to her in Thai, because I thought it'd be better to speak to her in that language. We haven't spoken Thai we usually don't speak Thai to each other these days. We usually speak English, but I could remember what I needed to say, and there was tears in my eyes, and I was really quite nervous to say it, and but I was resolute, and that's the important thing. I was resolute. I apologized for the harm that I'd caused her. I apologized for the hurt, because I really realized it on retreat. We're digging down deep. We're digging into our psyche, and 40 years later, it's still coming up. This remorse and shame about the hurt that I caused. Anyway, so she gave it to me. She forgave me, and she's quite small, and she kind of reached up and she gave me a hug and patted me on the back and said, "It's okay, Malcolm. It's okay. It's okay. You were young. You were young. You were too young to understand the responsibility of the family. You weren't ready to take on the responsibility of the family." I was quite young, and this action was healing for both of us. She contacted me a bit later, and she said it was very powerful for me to apologize, and it was a kind of a real movement for her, and it was also powerful for me, and it was also a beginning to be able to forgive myself for the actions that I've done, as I was confused. I was fooled by Mara. So anyway, there's a story of Angulimala, not Angulimala, Angulimala. A mala is a bead, a string of beads, but this person's name is Angulimala, and he was around in the time of the Buddha, and you could say his actions were also driven by delusions, but they were much more extreme than mine. The delusions that he had were related to a philosophical point. He was a student of philosophy, and he was studying with a teacher, and the teacher told him to get further teachings or to progress in this particular teachings, he had to go out and I don't know if this is true for the number, but he had to collect 1,000 fingers of people he had killed and put it on a mala. I mean, this is a story, maybe it was 100, but it's said, it's talked about as 1,000. So this Angulimala, he went forth and he killed lots of people. He became a serial killer, and he was greatly feared by everyone. And he got up to 999 fingers apparently, and he was getting ready to kill his last person. And at that time, his mother found out that he was in the area where she was, and she set out, perhaps with some food and someone to feed him. But I think she set out with the hope that she could change his ways, bring some sense to him. So she set out and was going out to visit Angulimala, but of course Angulimala needed to kill one more person. And apparently, again, I don't know the fruits of karma, but apparently it's really very unwholesome karma to kill your parents, to murder your parents. Very, very unwholesome. Probably, if you look at the cosmology of Buddhism, one would be born in hell and be there for a very, 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 very long time. So, at this time, the Buddha was able to see these circumstances through his psychic visions. He could see this situation happening. He could see the mother going out there, and he realized he could also see the potential for awakening in Angulimala. He could see that he was being driven by delusions. So he did some psychic tricks, and the Buddha went out there and got in front of Angulimala's mother, and was just walking along this path, and Angulimala saw him and started to chase him. He's starting to chase him, but the Buddha did another psychic trick, and he made it seem that no matter how fast Angulimala tried to chase the Buddha, he just couldn't reach him. He just couldn't. He couldn't catch up with him. And Angulimala eventually yelled out to him and said, he told him to stop. Or I think that's what he yelled out. But anyway, he yelled out in desperation, "Why can't I reach you? Why can't I stop? Why can't you stop?" And what the Buddha did then, the Buddha did stop. He turned around and he stopped. He said, "I've stopped. Why haven't you?" And at that statement, it's like it went bing with Angulimala. He realized the error of his ways, and he dropped to his knees and he begged for the Buddha to be his teacher. And of course, what happened then? Angulimala ordained as a monastic, and he went off and became enlightened. But what's interesting is that his karma followed him. People weren't killing him like he was killing people. It wasn't this kind of tit for tat fruit actions and fruit response. But wherever Angulimala went, he received harm. He would go on Pindapat, which is alms round, and he wouldn't receive much alms. He wouldn't receive much food, or sometimes he'd receive nothing. And every time he went out, he would be beaten up, or he'd be stoned, or people would throw sticks at him. He'd always come back from his arm rounds with injuries. So it wasn't quite the fact that he wasn't being killed, but he was receiving some sort of negative consequence for his actions. And similar to myself, I did not have, I went off and had a future partner, and the partner I'm with now. And my current partner doesn't go off and have affairs. Like one would think that would be the karmic fruit of such behavior. But at the time, my ex-wife, when I first connected with my current partner, my ex-wife warned her about trusting me. So there was this kind of the fruit of my karma was manifesting as a level of mistrust in my closest people, and I suffered some social rejection, and I suffered a lot of shame. And then later in my life, that hindrance of remorse comes up. So I'm not having, my partner isn't going off and having affairs, but I am suffering from my actions nonetheless. I'm suffering the fruit of my actions. So the simple solution for getting off the wheel of samsara, which is this cycle of suffering we are caught in, is by not creating negative karma, basically, and by creating wholesome karma, which gives us the circumstances and the capacity to wake up. It is by living with impeccable ethics, harmless. And there is, in the time of the Buddha, he left his home when he was about 29, and he said it went off and practiced with two teachers. He practiced the jhanas, and then he went off and practiced the ascetic life for 6 years, and this wasn't working, and he eventually found the middle way and became enlightened. And then he wandered, and when the Buddha came back to the place that he left, to his home, the Buddha's ex-wife pointed out to the Buddha's son, whose name was Rahula. He said, "See that man? Go and ask him for your inheritance." So the Buddha left home when Rahula was born. He was experiencing great samvega. Samvega is this urge to wake up, to see through the cycles of suffering. And he left home. He left the comforts of his home, including his newly born son. And so when he came back to the place that he was raised, the place he lived, the wife said, "Go and find your inheritance." And Rahula went up to the Buddha and said, "Please give me my inheritance." So the Buddha ordained him as a novice, and he was the youngest of the monastics. So he was 6 years old, and he had some training. The training that he received was like this. He said, the Buddha said to him, or it may have been, I think it was the Buddha that said to Rahula, "This is your training. If you're about to do an action, consider if it's going to harm somebody or not. If it's going to cause harm in any way, either to yourself or others. And if it is, don't do it." And he went on to say, if you find yourself in the middle of a harmful action, then stop. And he went on to say, if you found yourself in the middle of an action, if you found you had completed a harmful action, if you've done something harmful and hurtful, then talk to your mentor about it. Not confess, I suspect. Confess to your mentor. Talk to your mentor. Tell your mentor. Because if you can be honest with someone else, you can be honest with yourself. So this is a really good training, and I think by living ethically and harmlessly requires that we ingrain this awareness into everything we do, every moment of our waking experience, and to be wise about how our mental distortions can deceive us. So when Mara comes to tempt us, we do like the Buddha did. And actually, after the Buddha was awakened, there's records of Mara coming to visit him on occasions. And I think the usefulness of this, the usefulness of talking about this or letting people know about this was as a demonstration of how to deal with temptations. So Mara would visit the Buddha and tempt him, especially when he's old. He said to the Buddha, "You're very old, and why don't you give up and let it go, and let your ministry go, and don't do anything." However, the Buddha would say to Mara, "I see you, Mara. I see you. I see what you're doing. I'm not going to be fooled by you. I see you." And apparently, Mara would sulk off and go off and feel defeated. But when this happens to us, what our challenge is to be aware and heedful and mindful of every action we do, ensuring that it's not harmful. And when Mara comes along, like Mara did for me, with the temptations of breaking the precepts or doing something foolish that's harmful to oneself or others, we say, "I see you, Mara. I see you. You can't trick me. I can get around this. You can't get around me." So the precepts are very helpful principles to live by. They are ethical codes that protect us. And as a psychologist, I practice according to ethical codes. And a lot of professionals do this as well. Other professionals do this as well. And it's very, very helpful. I know that in my professional practice, by sticking to my ethical codes, I'm protected. There's no room for people to accuse me or blame me of various things, because I'm sticking to a code that is protecting myself, and it's also protecting the population out there. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 basic Buddhist precepts for lay people. And I went through them before. And I think, did I mention the 5th one? I think the 5th one is the 5 Buddhist precepts. I'll mention them again. Restraint in killing living beings, restraint in taking that which doesn't belong to us, restraint in speech that is harmful and deceptive, a restraint in sexual misconduct, and restraint in intoxicants that cloud the mind, not indulging in intoxicants that cloud the mind. So if we can maintain those basic precepts, we're on a good wicket. It's they're basically protecting us in our lives. And when I was a monk in Thailand, when I was a monastic in Thailand, as a bhikkhu, there were 227 precepts. 227 precepts. In addition, as a monk, there were many different trainings to adhere to. Like, you'd go to a particular temple, and in that temple, not only would you need to stick to those 227 precepts, but you'd also need to stick to the protocols and the procedures of that particular monastery. And it could be very overwhelming to think of all the rules that you needed to remember. And what would happen is that every 2 weeks, every fortnight, a lunar fortnight, we would get together as a collective, as an order, and we would chant something called the Patimokkha, which is the 227 precepts. One monk would chant and everyone else would listen. And at that time, one of the challenges of one of the duties, I suppose, of a monastic is to memorize the 227 precepts and to be able to chant it. And it usually took about an hour, I think, something like that. So it was pretty phenomenal that someone could remember it, or monastics could remember it. But after the chanting of the 227 precepts, we would have the opportunity to talk about our deviations or confess. So we'd pair up with another monastic and confess to our deviations from the precepts. And there are some particular precepts that have pretty harsh penalties. The harshest of these are that you need to disrobe. And I think they're called the Sangha Disesa. They're particular precepts, and I won't go into details about those precepts, but I wanted to mention that this process of confessing, or process of facing up to it and admitting to breaking the precepts, was phenomenally freeing. It was really very helpful. It was really helpful insofar as it kind of let go of this burden that we were carrying around. It kind of cleared one's mind, but it also strengthened our resolve to maintain those precepts, to maintain and be steadfast in and resolute in not deviating from them in the future. So I've been reading a wonderful book. I'm still reading it. I'm actually not reading it. I'm listening to it on a podcast. And it's The Stillness Flowing. I mentioned this book earlier. The Life and Stillness Flowing, The Life and Teachings of Ajahn Chah. It's a wonderful book. And it's really powerful for me because they're talking about the monastic life, and it brings up many memories. But there's a story of Ajahn Chah before he met Ajahn Mun, the great master Ajahn Mun. And he was a Dhutanga monk, which means he wandered homeless. He wandered around the forests in northeast Thailand, and he would wander around with Dhutanga monks have this, what's called a grot, which is this big umbrella-like thing that hangs from a tree or somewhere, and it has a mosquito net around it. So Dhutanga monks take refuge under their grot of an evening, and they might sleep, meditate under it and sit under it. Or they would go to other places, often charnel grounds, for example, where people were burnt and cremated. Dead people, sorry, not live people, of course. So Ajahn Chah was a wandering monk, and he'd heard of the great master Ajahn Mun. And Ajahn Mun basically, he was around the time of early last century, early 20th century. And he kind of established a forest meditation tradition. He revised the meditation, the power of meditation, and meditation in the Sangha. But anyway, he sought him out. Ajahn Chah sought him out and went to him with a question, or a few questions, more than one. But the first question he asked was how to remember all the trainings without his head exploding. I mean, he said, how can I remember all these trainings without my head going off? And Ajahn Mun responded to him by saying, well, basically, hiri-otapa. Hiri-otapa. And he also emphasized being heedful and being mindful. But hiri-otapa, it's a really, I'll explain this. Hiri-otapa is considered as the guardians of the world, or the protectors of the world. And there are a few translations of this term. Hiri is often translated as wise shame, and otapa as fear of negative consequences. So here, wise shame can be distinguished from toxic shame. The latter, or toxic shame, is often arises with people that I see in therapy, for example. Toxic shame often arises when we've been harmed or hurt or abused or experienced some terrible traumas or abuse or something like that. And it's not healthy. It's really caused a lot of suffering. And Brené Brown describes toxic shame as the fear of not connecting. It's like the fear. It's a socially related suffering, and it's this anxiety about the way other people will perceive us, and then we ingrain it, and we take it on and personalize it, and take it on to be who we are, like this. There's something innately wrong about us. This is toxic shame. I'm talking about toxic shame. And, there's a lot we can talk about with toxic shame. And there's a lot of therapies and treatments that we can undertake to overcome it. But why shame is something different. Why shame acts in a way to protect social propriety, as we do not want to do the types of actions that the wise and our social networks would later condemn. Another translation for hiri is conscience. And that's a word, I haven't heard that word much in recent years. I remember I used to hear it a lot when I was a student, I was a school student actually, in the late 60s and the 70s, the early 70s, adherence to conscience. I think it was in our school motto actually, about living according to your conscience. And conscience is a good way of describing why shame. It's about not doing an action because it's the wrong thing to do. You know that it's would be socially, and it would go against the fabric of our communities and our humanity. It's the opposite of shameless activities that some people partake in, some people act on. And I think of some politicians, for example, not so much in Australia, but overseas, that consider that there's no consequences for their actions, and act shamelessly. So wise shame is a healthy component of protecting us from doing unwholesome actions. And another translation of otapa is care. So, conscience and care, heedfulness about what we do. And I would say that means being very mindful of our actions, so that they don't cause harm, they don't hurt anyone. So an aspect of wrong view, and about right views. I mean, we have right view is the first factor on the Noble Eightfold Path. Wrong view has a few aspects. One aspect is that there are no consequences for actions. In other words, one could say that one doesn't believe in karma. When you look at that deeply, it means that we don't believe that the actions we do will have any effect on the world around us, on ourselves. They have no consequences. And this belief, which is wrong view, could lead to lots of heedless behaviors with no consideration of the consequences of the actions we do. However, if we can attend to things in a mindful way, we begin to discover the reality of karma for ourselves. And in this way, we can change the way things work out by restraining from that which may hurt someone or harm someone and acting wholesomely. There are this restraint requires heedfulness or care or mindfulness. And it's the care not to harm anything or any being. And it's to restrain from unwholesome actions and cultivate the wholesome. In other words, walking on the path. So heedlessness, I know I mentioned earlier that karma needs to have an intention for it to be wholesome or unwholesome, for it to result in wholesome or unwholesome fruit. But I think heedlessness can also result in lots of suffering. And heedlessness is one of the strongest causes of bad karma, because we might be heedless about something and unintentionally cause a lot of harm. And the fact that we're heedless could, there could be this heedlessness has an effect, has a negative effect. And there's an example of this I'd like to bring to you. I was about a couple of weeks ago, I was in Sydney, and I was driving my ute to the tip at Richmond, or in close by Richmond, and I was going along Backtown Road, and my back tray was completely full, so I couldn't see out the back. And I was driving along at about 80 kilometres an hour, and I know the turn off to the right to the tip was on the right, some way ahead, but it's kind of around a bend, so you can't really see the sign for it. The sign is on the right rather than on the left, where we're on the side we're driving. So I was driving along Blacktown Road, and I knew the turn off would be soon, but I was just spacing out. I was kind of looking at the traffic ahead of me. I was driving about 80 kilometres an hour, and I kind of knew that there were some people behind me, but then I suddenly saw the turn off, and I slammed on my brakes. When I slammed on my brakes, I then put my indicator on, which was probably illegal. I hope nobody's going to listening to that right now that might fine me or anything like that. But it was a heedless activity, because from behind I heard this loud honk. It was a loud horn going beep, and then to my left I saw this very big truck pass me quite fast. So obviously I could have been hit. I could have caused an accident by my heedlessness. I wasn't intending on causing an accident, but I could have caused a lot of suffering, and the chain reaction of all sorts of problems. I could have even injured someone, probably even myself. So I realized that my heedlessness, it wasn't intentional, but it was something that I could have prevented if I was mindful, if I was present, if I was aware, that I could, if I was heedful and mindful, I would have put on the indicator much before the turn off. So I'm just telling you this because it takes discipline to develop heedfulness and mindfulness with everything we do. And maintaining the precepts, our ethical code, is an extension of this mindfulness. It provides the foundation for meditation, which leads to the production of wisdom, which is ultimately liberating. And there's a verse in one of the books of the Vinaya. The Vinaya is the rules of the monastic, and there's a whole section of training in the Vinaya. And here is some. This is a verse in one of the Vinaya books. So discipline is for the sake of restraint. Restraint for the sake of freedom from remorse. Freedom from remorse for the sake of joy. Joy for the sake of rapture. Rapture for the sake of tranquility. Tranquility for the sake of pleasure. Pleasure for the sake of concentration. Concentration for the sake of knowledge and vision of things as they are. Knowledge and vision of things as they are for the sake of disenchantment. Disenchantment for the sake of release. Release for the sake of knowledge and vision of release. Knowledge and vision of release for the sake of final nibbana through non-clinging. So For those of you who've done training with me with serenity meditation, you'll often hear me talk about how there's a way of one thing being associated with another, and that thing is associated with another. So when we can have gladness, for example, that can give rise to spiritual pleasure. And with spiritual pleasure, that can give rise to piety or joy. And with joy, that can give rise to happiness. With happiness, that can give rise to contentment. With contentment, that can give rise to equanimity, and so on and so forth. So this is just laying out that kind of pathway, and it's talking about how discipline is in the beginning. Discipline. In other words, our moral precepts, our ethics. It's better not to act on harmful intentions in the first place. And if we've committed harmful intentions or harmful activity, it's also very helpful to be completely honest with ourselves and resolve not to do it again. And it's helpful to make amends if we need to. And it is also helpful to tell someone who is compassionately wise. Asking and giving forgiveness is also very powerful. And forgiveness to others and oneself. And it's like, as I mentioned earlier, it's like letting go of a great burden that we are necessarily carrying around. And it is also healing. So I'm going to finish the talk with a Buddhist prayer of forgiveness, which many of you will know. So you can kind of tune into it if you wish. If I have harmed anyone in any way, either knowingly or unknowingly through my own confusions, I ask their forgiveness. If anyone has harmed me in any way, either knowingly or unknowingly, through their own confusions, I forgive them. And if there is a situation I'm not ready to forgive, not yet ready to forgive, I forgive myself for that. For all the ways that I harm myself, negate, doubt, belittle myself, judge, or be unkind to myself through my own confusions, I forgive myself. So thank you for your attention, and let's have a few moments quietude and reflection.